All right, economic friends, here we go. Our final reading, our final assignment, our final chapter for the year, chapter 27, appropriately named Parting Thoughts. And I think this is a great reading just because it kind of brings together a lot of our final ideas and kind of puts a real bow or crown upon some of the big takeaways from hopefully what I've been trying to impart in this economics class. And so, number one, ask the question, what are three primary economic fallacies, given one of his examples, or problems with each one of these? And so the first, fallacy is that economics is a zero-sum game. The second one is the role of competition. And then the third one is not thinking beyond initial consequences. So starting with a zero sum game basically means that if somebody gains, somebody else loses. That if somebody takes or achieves or wins or gets what they want, then somebody else necessarily has less of what they wanted. And so that the sum is always going to add up to zero. You add something to one side, you have to subtract from the other side, and that creates a sum of zero. And he says that's not true. That transactions, economic transactions, do not have to necessarily be adversarial, where only one side is gaining or one side is benefiting. Sometimes it might not look like both sides are gaining the same amount, but his whole point is that in a free market, exchanges only happen if both sides think they're getting a good deal. And so that if it's in a free market, and the best way to protect against this is in a free market that there is leave it free, so that people are in fact voluntarily doing this, so that people are only making transactions, um, working, paying, buying, selling, producing, supplying, all the things that go on with economics. They're only sacrificing, investing. They're only happening because each side, not just one side, but each side believes they are getting something out of it. And there are not winners and losers, and there are not oppressors and the oppressed, which so often is a narrative that tries to get pushed and how people see. And and the assertion is that then the way you're going to fix this is it going to trigger government control? We're going to send in the referee. We're going to send in the regulation. We're going to send in the third party to make sure that the oppressor is not cheating out the oppressed, and to try to rebalance the scales. And he just points out the simple problem with this is that then if people are voluntarily benefiting from these transactions, whenever you come in and try to tip the scales another direction, you are actually perverting the justice or the prosperity that was going to take place, because both sides thought they were going to get a good deal. And so that rather than make things more equal or more just, you're actually going to slow the whole process. You're going to retard, you're going to diminish the overall process. Fewer transactions, less productivity, less prosperity is going to take place, because you're interfering with what people voluntarily are perceiving as a benefit for each side. And he used a specific example of rent control. That when we try to come in and I'd say setting prices at any point, but that when you come in and say, oh, I'm going to help the people who want the renters at the expense of the ones who are the landlords, then what you're doing is you're actually going to discourage the landlords. You're going to discourage the developers. They're not going to produce. They're not going to keep up their apartments, and they're going to do a worse job as landlords. And there's going to be less of a supply of affordable housing. And so even though you say I'm helping one side in the short term, you're actually hurting them in the long term, because you're discouraging both sides from serving each other by coming up with a mutually beneficial voluntary transaction. And so that interference and assuming that somebody's losing out in these transactions, someone's being taken advantage of, uh, creates an interference that actually ends up harming the overall productivity of both sides. The second fallacy, the role of competition, he's just basically saying it's a fallacy to underestimate what the regulation that competition is providing. That a lot of times a free market, people hear the word laissez-faire and they think of uncoordinated chaos. No one's in charge. There's just a bunch of exploiters, people out for themselves and trying to cheat and steal and just get away with to the heck with everybody else at everyone else's expense. And he just points out that that's a fallacy. That in fact competition, as long as there's competition, um, then regulation is taking place, because buyers and sellers are having to balance our natural urge to win and get what we want at the expense of others, with having to do a better job of serving or working or paying or producing than the next person. And so that competition is a powerful form of regulation. It just tends to be a below the surface or kind of invisible or not subtle, but it's easy to overlook what it's actually doing. And he gives the example of labor unions trying to say, okay, we're gonna make sure that we need to regulate how much businesses pay to their workers and give them a more fair share of productivity because it's not fair. They're being exploited. And there's no regulation here. Well, owners can simply just keep as much money as they possibly want and cheat out all their workers. And so we got to come in and we got to regulate that because there's no regulation here. And he says, no, 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 there's competition there. There's competition in that a company cannot simply, one, pay its workers whatever it wants because a competitor will come in and steal those workers from them by paying them more. And also that if you take away, if you say, that you decide that a company only needs to make a certain profit and the rest needs to go to their employers, you are diminishing that company's ability to invest in itself and improve. And it's going to, people aren't going to invest in that business anymore. If they see that I invest in this company and that money is not being developed, instead it's going all to pay the workers or to meet these higher expenses, they're going to take their investment and put it into another industry. And so this is what happens where, again, what we're finding is that heavily labor unionized industries cannot compete and do not prosper, and they go into decline compared to industries that are not unionized. And that where many unionized industries are retracting, with the exception of government, where they just can spend and spend and tax to kind of keep the boat afloat. In the private sector, heavily unionized businesses are retracting because they are not receiving the investment they would be otherwise, and the private industries are actually expanding, and they're actually doing a better job for their workers and offering better benefits for their workers and employing more people because they allowed the natural competition among firms to determine the, employee benefits, employee wages, and the amount of investment versus saying, oh, we're going to decide what's fair externally. We need to assert an external control. He says, no, 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 no. Competition provides a natural control that's going to fix this. We also talked about discrimination. How that discriminating is a costly thing for a business in the free market to do. And again, the competition of taking away workers, if you discriminate against qualified workers, your competition is going to snap them up and you're going to pay the price, or you're not going to fill that position and you're going to lose money and you're going to pay the price. And your competition with other people is going to say, you know what, you can't afford to discriminate against that person. You need to hire the best if you really want to succeed. So again, that competition regulates many of the things we're worried about if we just look closely enough at it. Okay, and then the third fallacy is that we tend not to think beyond initial consequences. Short-term gains. We're going to manipulate the free market. We're going to institute an economic policy in the short term. There's great benefits, and he points out, politicians, this makes sense because they're on an election cycle. They're not looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future. They're looking at 2 to 4 years ahead, and whether that it's going to have the appearance that they're doing something useful or beneficial. And he says that's a very dangerous fallacy. And he gives the example of restricting the importation of foreign steel. The idea that, we're not going to import steel from another country because we want to protect jobs of American workers in the steel industry. And in the short term, hey, that looks good. We're protecting America. We're saving steel jobs. In the long run, he says what happened is it actually sharply increased the price of steel in the United States, so that all the businesses in the whole country that relied upon steel saw their costs go up. Many of them went out of business or lost productivity or had to let go of workers, and that the amount of jobs lost and the amount of economic havoc produced by artificially causing steel prices to go up by not allowing those imports in, they actually outweighed the number of jobs saved by that justified the initial, we're not going to import steel or pick any product. We're not going to import that product from another country because we want to protect the jobs at home. The short term, maybe you pull that off. The long term, you weaken the entire economy and you end up costing even more jobs than you supposedly, quote unquote, saved. We talked in the last video about, saving a life, that at what point, how much does it cost to protect life and save people's lives? At what point are you spending and directing so many resources to save a life that you're actually exposing far more lives to destruction and death down the road? Anyway, yeah, the COVID-19 being a big example of this. We look at the short term, again, right now, oh yeah, our cases of COVID-19 are down compared to Sweden, which did not have an extensive lockdown. So short term, it worked. Long term, we don't know, because now if everybody wants to go out, people are still going to go get infected and get sick, and some will die, whereas Sweden might have an immunity, and all of a sudden the flu is not going to be as drastic there. So long term, they might be had more deaths compared than us per capita to date, but in the long run it might end up being lower, including deaths of despair and negative consequences of not having destroyed their economy. So again, the fallacy of that short-term gains without thinking through what's going to be the long-term effect of this. And you see that's a huge one. You see that throughout lots and lots of economic policies. Question number two, what does Sol mean that nothing is easier to proclaim than a wonderful goal? What frightening example does he give? What antidote does he say can prevent this? Just the simple idea that it's very easy to say a wonderful goal. Saying something just doesn't make it so. In fact, what are the facts? You can proclaim and say this is what you intended to do. That you can say what your goals are, but that's the easy part. The fact is what's actually going on. What is the actual effect? What have you produced? You can call your society the Great Society and a war on poverty, but is it actually great? Did it actually benefit the country? Did it actually pull people out of poverty? What was the actual effect? And he gives the frightening example of the law passed in Germany under Hitler, that he said the name of the law was the law to relieve the distress of the people and the Reich. A great title. They're relieving the distress of the people and the Reich. And it's easy to say that. It's easy to name something, like the recent, some of the bills being passed by Congress, the CARE Act. It sounds nice. They care, they're giving out money. But that specific law in Germany is actually what gave Hitler dictatorial powers that helped him seize control of the government, outlaw opposing political parties, persecute the Jews and assassinate anybody who opposed him, and then eventually lead the whole world into war and Holocaust. So it's easy to say, oh, we're going to relieve the distress of the people in the Reich, but what are the facts on the ground? What is and again, economics, what does the dismal science actually say? It's really important to look at that. And he says, what's the antidote to this? When, again, people saying, we're going to fix this, or we're going to spend this, or we're going to right this wrong, or we're going to pass this law or change this policy. How do we know if that's going to actually work? He says, you need to know your history. History teacher. There it is. I once said in class, you can't know anything without knowing your history. And I think I encourage you to explore that idea, because that's what he says here is you got to know your history. That history is humbling. History is replete with people who said one thing, and then, well, what actually happened when that idea was actually tested and people had to live under that form of government or under that policy or under that form of relief of distress? What was the actual result? We all know the phrase, you got to know your history so you don't repeat it. But we actually got to believe that do we actually have we actually looked at what happens when governments interfere with economies, or what actually happens when economies are allowed to operate on the free market? Do we actually know our history so that we can see what works, and so that we can avoid the terrible, terrible costs that bad policies and good words and good intentions can sometimes play out? That the road of hell paved with good intentions, because that's the easy part. It's very nice. I'm glad you have good intentions. It's very good that you can say good things, but does it actually work? And knowing our history, he argues, and looking at the facts on the ground can help protect us in this. The third question, Sol writes that market economies are not money economies so much as what kind of economies, and why are free markets better at this than controlled ones? He says, don't think of a free market as money, transaction of money. He says the number one thing being transacted, and I already said this in the other video, the number one resource on the planet is information. They are information economies. That what the free market does better than even allowing transfers of capital and transfers of resources and buying and selling and all this sort of stuff is they allow the conveyance of information more quickly, efficiently, and accurately than any specific person or entity, government, body, board, uh, you know, organization can possibly do it. That the free market of prices, costs and profits and losses and all that. We talked about those as messengers of reality, but that a free market allows information to flow freely, new ideas to be exchanged. Again, what's working versus what isn't working. How the supply and demand, all of that information travels very, very quickly in a free market. And we've equated that to being it's decentralized. There is no one group making decisions. And while that can sound chaotic, that can also be extremely efficient because you have all these conduits. You don't have just one or 8 or 20 minds and brains deciding things. You have 8 billion minds, brains, people producing ideas and uh, suffusing energy into the economy. And so, what one person or what one small group could not possibly manage in terms of information, the free market directs, kind of like crowdsourcing, and allows things to happen so much more quickly, accurately, and efficiently, rather than having to pass through some kind of controlled or planning authority that again will be biased, will be ignorant, will make mistakes, and which just can't make the decisions, however smart and intelligent, that are necessary to coordinate as many transactions as a free market is able to do. So a free market is a information economy. And I can't help it when I think about that like who controls the American economy? The people do. What a beautiful idea that is. That again, when we say we're a nation of the people, for the people, and by the people, I don't think I said that quite right, but you know what I mean. That's what capitalism, that's what the free market is. It's saying the people are conveying this information, or even an idea of the body of Christ. That Christ. What's the closest entity to God? It's the body. It's all people somehow coordinating together, not again under one person, a God king or a God government directing it, but everybody being free and that information being able to be transferred uh, quickly and efficiently and accurately. And that's what a free market does through the use of prices and profits and losses. And again, a clear conveyance of information. Seems to be the most efficient and prosperous way for things to get done. Number four, why is the most, or what is, yeah, see, I got a lot of typos in here. Sorry about that. What is the most important distinction to make in economics if we sincerely uh, care about the well-being of others and societies? Kind of a shorter answer, and we've already said it, but again, the biggest takeaway I'd hope maybe from this class is he says the most important distinction to make is what's between what sounds good and between what works. What sounds good and what works. And that, if you take anything from this class, I hope that you've become sensitive to that question, that a lot of stuff gets said. A lot of stuff, you'll hear a lot of stuff's going to be promised, a lot of ideas and philosophies, and smart people with degrees and authority because they're on some sort of TV or website or whatever are going to say stuff. But we have to learn to distinguish between what sounds nice or sounds fair or sounds good between, well, what actually works. And economics at its best shows us what works. So then we can make a decision as to, again, if we really want to save lives, if we really want to create equality, if we really want to protect against exploitation or against discrimination over and over and over again. I hope you've seen that in our readings and our lessons, that um, what sounds right oftentimes is not what actually produces the things that we want. Again, what we want, and even the people who I think are making errors, including myself, it's not that they want bad things, but we can't make that. We have the problem making the distinction between, well, how do I actually get what I want? And sometimes that means surrendering some of our prideful ideas of how we think things should work. And again, you see there's a whole Christian lesson in here about God's will and our will. God knows our will. God knows what we want, and we can say, well, I'm going to make it happen this way. And again, we could end up destroying the very thing we actually want. And so the most important distinction as you move forward is what's the truth? Not your theory, not your idea, not your morality, not your definition, but what is the truth, so that because you probably do sincerely care about your own well-being and the well-being of your country and the well-being of the people around you, you want to distinguish between what works rather than what simply sounds good. Okay, well, if you made it through this, congratulations. Appreciate you following along, and I love you guys and wish you the best. And let's have a good graduation in a few days. All right, take care.